Challenges. This is what you wanted to talk about. Over to you. What do you mean by challenges? Are you talking about challenges in terms of difficulty or challenges in terms of challenging your perception in a game, challenging, like we talked about with Doki Doki Literature Club, the idea of a game itself? What do you mean by challenges?
Why not all of those things? I think it'd be interesting to talk about all of them.
Well, that's an easy
But
answer.
but let's start with one of the first questions I had for you, which is just personally, what are you more interested in when it comes to a game? Are you more interested in a game that challenges you in your thinking in terms of something puzzling, or you have to think through to get a solution to progress in the game? Or do you prefer games that challenge you mechanically? So you have to have really great mechanics, whether it's action or it could be even something like clicks per minute, action per minute, right? In your real time strategy games, those are still mechanical challenges as well as obviously thinking strategic challenges. But if you were to, think about what kind you prefer, or do you prefer a balance? And if there, or what kind of balance, what percent of each do you think you would like?
Yeah, I would say today the idea of getting as many clicks per minute as possible makes my heart beat fast and makes me sick to my stomach. Like I just no, I admire those who can do that. I admire esports players, but that's just not. It's just not what I've been doing since I was a teenager. Now there was a time when I played, Super Nintendo and stuff, where it was all about the tactility and versatility of my hands on the pad, and I loved that. So I'm not against it, and I certainly have no experience. I don't have any. Sorry, what am I trying to say? I have experience with that. It's just as a kid. Today, the challenges I enjoy most are probably strategic, and understanding the best way to use the game to beat the situation at hand, to win, to succeed. Also, to find the right answer to a question. So puzzles, yes, but I can get frustrated by puzzles. So if I think of RPGs, the ones that we've talked about before, whether it's newer CRPGs like Divinity Original Sin, Baldur's Gate 3, or the original Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and those isometric RPGs, if I came across a puzzle that was really difficult to solve and you had to run across the map and find the different pieces and read into the lore and understand how different pieces fit together, knowing how I've played before, I would probably try to skip that and look it up online in a walkthrough and just do it to get to the next thing, because I don't have time. And we've talked about this. I don't like that, and I have played before games where I've decided, no, I'm not going to look anything up. That's the challenge. Is I'm not going to look anything up about this game. I'm not going to refer to anything. I'm not going to cheat, quote unquote, and I'm going to figure it out no matter how long it takes me, whatever puzzle I come across, no matter how frustrating it is. And I'm quite rewarded, actually, in those circumstances. I don't know how much stamina I have to continue doing that in a puzzle heavy game, but I do appreciate it if I've decided to go that way. So the question for challenges is tough for me because I almost have to invite the challenge in and accept the challenge in the game, or I'll skip it because I'm too entitled. I'm too selfish when I play. I've decided that I'm going to play today for the mechanics, or I'm going to play today for the story. I'm going to play today to get as many rewards as I can, and that can be problematic. But what it means is that when I play, I'm looking for one thing sometimes and one kind of challenge, and often for me, it's the strategic one.
Apropos of nothing, have you started Outer Wilds yet?
Yes, yes. I'll tell you, I started playing for about 20 minutes and was very frustrated learning how to fly the ship. In the training, like right at the beginning, you have to learn to fly the little platform, and it doesn't hover, or maybe I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem to hover. So you have to hit the engine and then take it off and hit the engine so that you can land on certain surfaces. I did not pass that part. I haven't even therefore begun the game. I'm still in the tutorial, and it was frustrating. But I know it's something I have to get over. It was the same thing when we played Valheim. This tactility of moving a person around that I'm not used to. But I don't dislike the challenge. I'm easily frustrated by it because I'm not used to it.
Right. There was something interesting there too in what you said, because when I was saying puzzle, I didn't mean it in the same way that you've referenced it. I meant like in puzzle games, right? Games where the whole game is thinking, right? You're just like, Sudokus are a puzzle, but you can have any kind of video game that are puzzle games. And you took it to mean more sort of quest lines that have you trying to figure out, like more of a story, like let's say exploratory. Like, see, I wouldn't use puzzle for that at all, because to me that's not really, you're not having to figure anything out. You just have to take in the information, like go find the information. You're
Right.
finding something as opposed to solving something.
So what's
um,
an example of a puzzle game?
I mean, one that I would love for you to play a little bit of at one time, which I mentioned, was Baba Is You. It's probably one of the coolest puzzle games I've seen ever. It's a newer indie game well, not so new anymore, but one of the newer games. There's a lot of coding type puzzle games that I've mentioned to you before. So Human Resource Machine is one that I think you would find interesting, especially as a developer, because it's a user interface essentially for coding. And so there's puzzle, every single level is just a puzzle. Like you have to, it'll tell you to do something and you have to figure out with what they've given you how to do that. Um, those are the two that come to the top of my head. I mean, but there's a lot of puzzle games out there. That old school traffic jam one, right, where you have to move the little cars around to get your car through the traffic jam. There's like the pipe ones, the ones where you have to send like water or something flowing through pipes and you have to rotate all the pipes to make a path go
Yeah.
through. There's a million games like that. Those are, there's also something that you might be interested in. Oh, I forget what the developer is, but it's a famous, like, this is all he does is he makes crazy puzzle games. But there's one that is like all about alchemy, where you kind of like you try to make molecules out of different chemicals to get a particular like result. But it's more physical. There's like geometry and physical aspects to it. So that's a puzzle game. Not that there aren't other kinds. There's like puzzle platformers, right, which is more similar to what you were thinking. Like, oh, I have to hit that lever to make the water go up so that I can then swim over there and hit another button to open a door. Like that's also kind of a puzzle. Um, Puzzle platformers often fall into that realm. But yeah, I didn't mean it. And not that, trying to put a bunch of things together to figure out where, let's say, treasure is hidden as a side quest in an RPG isn't a puzzle. But that probably isn't the goal of the game as a whole. RPG games, I think, the challenge isn't either in puzzling necessarily or in mechanics, although it depends. You can have RPGs, and there are lots of RPGs where the challenge comes from mechanics. So something like where you're fighting, where it's an action combat, and therefore there's challenge in fighting enemies. And there's not usually a lot of challenge necessarily in thought. So those were the two kinds of ways I separated up to ask
I
you,
see what
right?
you're saying. So then I would answer and say thought is where I put almost all of my need for challenge from a game. And I would say the need for challenge is crucial for probably anyone who plays games. If there's no challenge, there's no point, there's no game. In the same way that in theater or film, if there's no conflict, there's no story. If there's nothing coming against the protagonist and interacting with them and preventing them from getting what they want, there's no story. They just get what they want. And so it's interesting. And I think that, um, when it comes to the challenges that I'm looking for in a game, sometimes I'm looking for multiple challenges. So if we break the thought one down into different ones, we have different kinds of puzzles. We also have understanding the game to play as best as you possibly can. So we've mentioned paradox games before, whether it's Hearts of Iron, Stellaris, Crusader Kings, whatever. The more you understand the mechanics of the game, which can be incredibly complex and almost Byzantine, but the better you understand those mechanics, the better you are at playing the game. And the feeling is, I think that they're trying to create from a historical perspective, is the better you understand warfare, the better you understand court intrigue, the better you understand 17th century politics, the better you're going to do at the game, because they are abstractions of those things. And so it's not exactly the same thing, but let's say Hearts of Iron 4, which is a grand strategy game set in the Second World War from, I think, 1936 to 1948. You take a country, and whether you're trying to conquer the world or you're trying to survive or somewhere in between those two things, in the game, the better you understand the numbers of how building an infantry regiment works, the better you understand how navies work, the better you're going to perform in single player or multiplayer. But it's interesting because those things somewhat correlate to the actual fighting of war during that period. The countries that performed the best were the ones that best understood how bombers worked. It's what's his name, McNamara, the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Second World War, worked for the Air Force or the United States Army Air Force, and in calculating how bombs fell and how precise they could be to inflict the maximum damage on the industrial capacity of the enemy country, whether it was Japan or Germany. Understanding the numbers was critical to fighting that war. And so a player of Hearts of Iron 4 probably feels that they're almost in parallel to that historical example. So when I'm playing a strategy game, I definitely fall into that feeling of, oh, good, I'm understanding court intrigue. If we're talking about Crusader Kings 3, I'm better understanding how I'm going to marry off my children to achieve advantage for my family in that game, right? Because the mechanics are mirroring real life. And I love that because it ignites my imagination. It takes me back to another period. So I don't think of it as I'm mastering a game. Whereas maybe, uh, I'm not sure actually about this. This is maybe a question for you. Do you think that there are games where it's pure mastery, where there's no imagination required? Or is every game somewhat a combination of mastery with an imagined environment? So even if you think of Space Invaders, you can, it's pure mastery in order how many in order to achieve clicks to protect the planet, but you can put yourself into that and imagine yourself as the savior of Earth. So yeah,
How very Ender's Game of you.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
I do think that there are games that can be just mastery. And I think even like, you could totally think of old school arcade games that way. That doesn't mean that people don't enjoy still the story and the aspect of them there, but there's such an abstraction. Let's take something else. Let's take a fighting game, for example. Like a fighting game, sure, is an abstraction of fighting, but it in no way, I think, really mirrors. I mean, maybe it mirrors because from what I understand, and I have a friend who is a fighting game expert. So I've learned a little bit more from him because it's definitely not me that is an expert in these things. But the joy of playing fighting games is actually more that strategic joy that you were talking about, where it's against another person, because you're really reacting to what decisions and therefore things they can do in any moment and what you think they're going to do and how to respond to that. Much more so, like there's a lot of mechanical skill, but I think the better people get, there's mechanical skill, but it's a lot of what should I do right now? Then you have to be able to execute that, but you also have to have the right idea of what tactic you should use in that moment based on what your opponent just did. And maybe that aspect does mirror real life fighting in many ways, where you still have to be aware, when should you block, when should you open, right, based on what your opponent does. So maybe that isn't straight mastery in that way, but I think that there's a lot of games where people play them to just increase mechanically, like a straight mechanical improvement. There's a game called, I think it's Osu. Maybe that isn't quite right, but it's a game that's played by a lot of people who want to get better at MOBAs or other games like that, where your actions and your mechanics matter a lot. And it's a rhythm game, really. You have a bunch of clicks on the screen, and you have to click and drag your mouse and do certain things with your mouse to music, you're just following, and it's kind of this trance-like experience. But people use it as a way to practice and increase their just dexterity and straight up their reaction speeds. And I mean, it's a game in and of itself, but I've learned about it and know about it mostly as this thing that people who play MOBAs and want to get better play to get better in their spare time. So it's interesting how we have games now to help us train for other kinds of games. And while that's a rhythm game, which is then, an abstraction of rhythm, of moving to music and having a lot of mastery and control over that, is it just mechanics? I think it depends on the person, how much they use their imagination. And I think that that's more of a personal thing, and that obviously people will tend, therefore, to certain games more than others. Because if you aren't interested in using your imagination a lot, you're not going to play the games that only are story focused, which still have their own forms of challenges, but don't maybe scratch that mechanical itch for people. And you're probably going to focus on mechanical games.
So for you, mechanical and I mean, if we're physical and mental, really is what we're talking about. Physical challenges and mental
Mhm.
challenges. For you, where's the challenge reside? And within, and I'm assuming that a lot of it is probably mental for you, but within that, what are your challenges that you value most in games?
Um, so yeah, I definitely think I land on the mental side overall. I really do like puzzle games, but I really enjoy mastering mechanics as well. And there is something really satisfying in the same way that I enjoy movement in my personal life as a dancer and somebody who really just enjoys when you do master a particular kind of movement. And just I really like to focus on the way like my body literally moves in certain ways. I think there's an aspect of that that's similar mechanically in a game, where there's a beauty in it feeling right. You know, if you hit a tennis ball and it makes that perfect sound, if you hit a baseball and it makes that perfect sound, there is almost a very similar feeling if you get a perfect combo off in a video game. It feels good. And I do still think that I really enjoy that. While I do land more on the thinking side for challenges, I really like puzzle games. I also really like story games where it's more about putting things together or exploring or all of that. Um, I also really, really like just action games too. Like I enjoy platforming games, and that, a lot of the challenge is just in the movement, in the motion of getting places. I wouldn't say like it's not like I did play Celeste. I don't know if you've heard of Celeste, but it's a notoriously difficult platformer. Um, Very good game, by the way. It's supposed to mimic anxiety and like mental health issues by frustrating the heck out of you as a player to mirror the main character's own frustrations. And it's actually very well designed in that even though it's really hard, it's not punishing because the rooms are quite small. So you never go too far back, right? You only are focused on this one challenge that's ahead of you at a time. Uh, but I even played that, although I wouldn't say that normally I'm interested in challenging platforming puzzles. I think I will play the ideal game for me is one with a lot of exploration. And in a game like that, I don't even know where to say that the challenge comes from, because we were talking about games need a challenge. And what's the challenge in exploration? It's getting there, right? It's like, how do you see more? What do you have to do to see more, to learn more? And so I guess the challenge has to be mechanical almost, because unless the exploration is gated by a puzzle, like some sort of mental thing. So I think I'm more even, maybe even something like 60-40, favoring mental, but still high up there for mechanical difficulty. I don't know. I think it's a really hard question to ask, because a lot of my favorite games, I don't know if I can pinpoint where the challenge is. I can pinpoint what I like about them. And
Mm-hmm.
we talked about that, the surprise, which is why I like exploration games. You're always like, that's the point. You never know what you're going to find next. But that's not necessarily inherently challenging.
I wonder to what degree the mechanics become a vehicle for liberating you into the next level of the game, right? So if you're talking about an exploration game, there's certainly a mechanical understanding and capacity that you need to progress through the game. In fact, in many exploration games, that is the game, is navigating around and enjoying being able to do that. But at some point, once you've achieved mastery, that's when sometimes the game begins, truly. And it's no longer about becoming good enough or becoming even better. You're good enough and you can put it to the side. You've been liberated into just exploring, because, in a way, the controller or the keyboard is an extension of you and you don't have to think about it so hard anymore, and you just get to play. And so I wonder, once that happens, does the mechanics, is that considered essentially a challenge that has been overcome, an obstacle that has been passed through, and now the game can be 90-10 mental, for example? Or are we talking about games for you where once you've achieved a mechanical milestone, there's another mechanical milestone ad infinitum, which makes the game and the guts of the game until the end? What for you? Which of those would you prefer?
I think that I would like if the challenge somewhat kept up, because I think that keeps it um, worth playing. Like you said, like once there's no challenge, do you kind of get bored? Um, I think the other thing about having mechanical challenge that you are getting better at, one of the beauties, and again, this is true in anything that humans get better at, is going back to those things that you used to find challenging and breezing through.
Hmm.
And that feeling of the satisfaction of realizing that you've gotten better, that game developers throw in, right? Because if it's only constantly getting harder and harder, and you actually don't ever have that feeling of full satisfaction of that moment of wow, seeing everything you've learned and how far you've come. I think great games often throw that in at you and show you how far you've come, right?
Hmm.
Really give you that moment of look what you can do that you couldn't do before. A lot of games do this. Even like simple games that aren't really about the mechanics do that, where they'll show you how much stronger you've gotten by having you fight a boss that you fought and was difficult for you, earlier on in the game, or whatever it may be to show you. When I'm thinking of challenge and I was thinking about these mechanics, I keep coming up with Metroidvanias because I do really like Metroidvanias, and specifically Hollow Knight, which we've talked about before, and I would like you to give a try as well, um, where you are retracing your steps a lot, right? And as you unlock more abilities, you're able to go now to different places in the map that you've already seen, but you can go to new places you couldn't explore before and expand your map that way. And so you're constantly gaining new ways to maneuver that are therefore challenging because you have to learn and master them. But you're also getting better and better at the ones you were already using and seeing your progression, because now the places that were difficult before are easier. And the challenges that you had before as you get better are easier, but also as you unlock more powers are a bit easier. So I do think that having some level of it staying, like adding in new things. It's not, and this is the thing, is challenge and new the same thing? And I would say they're related, because something new is challenging to somebody just because they've just encountered it and they have to learn about it. And that can be a small challenge, even just giving them a new tool for their tool set that they have to decide how they're going to integrate it. What do you think it is for you?
I think that, yeah, I would agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think that I seek the liberation so that I can stop worrying so much about the physicality, but that might just be me today. That wasn't always me. So if I think back to Nintendo Wii, which is something that I played not too much of, but at the interregnum of my gaming life, at the beginning there was, Super Nintendo, Nintendo, and all this stuff. Now there is mostly PC gaming, grand strategy RPGs and stuff like that. Very little mechanics, or there's mechanics, but only so far as to get you into the game and then you forget about it. But in the middle, I remember I never owned one, but I played other people's Nintendo Wii, and it was almost entirely the sports game. So the tennis, bowling, baseball, whatever. And I loved it. I thought it was so fun because it really was physical. It didn't just mirror sports, it really was swinging a bat. Although eventually you realized you didn't have to full body swing the bat, you could just flick your wrist. That was eventually, oh yeah, I don't have to spend so much energy on this. Liberating, but also disappointing at the same time. And I loved that because I could forget about the mechanics, but still become better at the mechanics as I went. I could forget that I was trying so hard to understand this controller, but I was still trying to essentially understand the mechanics by swinging or rolling the ball or throwing a pitch or whatever motion I was doing, and that was really enjoyable. And I think this is probably where true masters, mechanical masters of games get to, is they're no longer mentally trying to understand their physical actions. They're just like any athlete would do. They're just doing, and the more they do, the better they become. Um, and I think I would like to do that. I am a physical person. I play real sports in my life, and I get immense enjoyment out of that. Um, I think that I would probably get tired if it was entirely in my fingers and my hands and my wrists, but something more full body. I don't necessarily we need to start talking about VR and AR, but that may be where games are going regardless. They already are in many ways headed in that direction, and I find that interesting. But in terms of challenge, uh, I would probably prefer the point at which the mechanical and the thinking go hand in hand, when they become almost indistinguishable from the other. So yeah, I don't have many good examples of that, but it's probably something I need to get into, especially as I'm trying to understand what games I would create. Because right now, I would I would probably stay far away from a mechanical game as a developer, because I don't even play that. I don't know how that would even work. But I shouldn't be too careful, as we talked about last time. Take some risks, right?
It doesn't have to be highly mechanical to still be mechanics focused. A lot of story games, I would still say the challenge comes from mechanics, as we identified. RPGs, which are really story games, often combat is the challenge, and combat is often, though not always, live. Right? Like there are turn based, and that could be the way you want to go, and therefore then the difficulty isn't in mechanics, it's rather in the thinking and the strategy of the combat. But yeah, an RPG, which is the most common kind of form of story game, let's say if you go down that route because you like story and that's at the end of the day what you want to do is tell an interesting story, could still be mechanical. Or maybe you go, no, you know what? I do want to do a turn based version of an RPG because that falls in line more with the way that I would want to be challenged and therefore the kinds of challenges I think I can provide as a developer. Is that kind of where you're trying to think? You know, would that be more than, let's say, if it were an RPG, then it would be more about the decisions, right? Because turn based in the end, it's about the decisions you make. It might as well be picking a dialogue option from a tree, except you're picking, a combat move out of a list.
Yeah, this is a tricky one, because I wonder for myself if, when I talk about doing a turn based game, or I talk about doing a game where the mechanics are clearly secondary, where it's thinking and strategizing, making decisions in the right order, but having as much time as I want to
Mhm.
make those decisions. And I wonder if that's a challenge that I'm seeking in and of itself, or if I'm avoiding the challenge. Right? Again, to go back to our conversation from our last episode about risk, am I just saying no? That's too hard. Either the mechanics of this are too hard, the dexterity that I need to play are too difficult, or I just need to think too quickly. I'd rather not. I'd rather be able to take my time, make mistakes, be on easy mode, so that I can make as many mistakes as I want, but still get the hit that I'm looking for from the game. So I don't know. I think that if I were to be able to spend more time gaming, I would probably really enjoy the mechanics, the physical aspect of gaming a lot more than I currently do, and I would probably have to just say screw it and face it head on, and be okay to fail, right? This is another idea of challenge, right? Like, to what extent do we want the challenges to have stakes, right? Again, when we talk about drama, so movies, television, theater, we ask the question, yes, there's conflict, but we also ask, what are the stakes? What happens if our hero, our protagonist, fails? There's the same thing in games, right? And there's both the stakes in the story, but there's also the stakes for me as a player. If I fail on easy cheat mode, it doesn't matter. I just change it, I just correct it. But if I fail on a really difficult Iron Man mode, maybe, or against another player, so we're playing together in real time, there's no pausing, we're just making this happen together, then my failure means an actual public, well, I don't know about public humiliation, but I lose in the same way that I lose if I'm playing a game of tennis or squash or badminton or something like that. I don't know why those are my racket sports are my examples, but they are. And I wonder, yeah, I wonder if I were to spend more time in that, because as we've talked about before, I've done very little multiplayer gaming. I wonder if, obviously, that would scare me, because I wouldn't be very good, and it would probably expose how dumb I am, and I'd have to live with that reality for the rest of my life, that I'm actually quite stupid and dumber than I thought, and not as quick mentally and whatever. But would I get more out of it? Would the challenge and the stakes of the challenge be higher? therefore increasing my enjoyment. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fine line between failure and the opportunity for success, right? Because at the end of the day, it feels great to achieve and overcome a challenge,
Yeah.
right? And I think the interesting part of this for me is we're talking about challenges in video games, but it comes back to what we talked about before, which is, what's the point? Why does one play a game? And where does the enjoyment come from? And I can't get away from the fact that for me, the enjoyment, the same as with comedy, comes from surprise, from the game giving me a new mental connection that I didn't have before. And I think this is why both you and I fall more on the mental side, because I think it's easier for both of us to have that sort of surprise and that sort of new connection made when it's a mental thing, when we are surprised by a strategy or learning something new, or figuring something out that we didn't know, rather than while it's still there, that surprise and delight of mechanically figuring something out. So that's still there, right? When you go, oh wow, I can do that. So that's one sort of surprise mechanically, where you just literally learn a new thing. You're like, oh, I can do something I didn't even know I could do. That's one surprise. But there's also the surprise and the delight of, you have been trying to do something, you knew you could, but you weren't able to physically do it, and then you do achieve it. The same as in a sport or something physical in the real life. But I think that it's maybe harder, I think, to develop a game where that's the kind of delight given, because I struggle to think of how many games have interesting and new mechanics in ways that really are a surprise, or do something that, a player plays and goes, wow, like that's why a lot of those puzzle platformers or other kind of games like that often do so well, is because I think they often throw in a new mechanic, like there's a theme and something they're using that is not the norm, right? They have something that just hasn't been done in that genre before, and therefore is tickles that newness, that I made a new brain connection thing, even though it's mechanical. Have you heard of Braid?
No.
It's a puzzle platformer. The main thing, and I actually haven't played through it, but the main thing is that it's a puzzle platformer where you can kind of go back in time a little bit, and that's, you use that. So there's the puzzling aspect of how do you use that to achieve what you need to do, but there's mechanics too, right? Like you have to be mechanically adept at this thing, and that was at the time when it came out, like kind of a new way to experience mechanics as well as puzzling in this genre. So yeah, I don't know, maybe it, this is maybe going to sound bad, but the reason I think neither of us is super just mechanics focused is I think we kind of find a lot of mechanical challenges samey, right? At least for me, I think that's true. Like I think about a lot of games and like, well, let's say you play a game with difficult combat and then you play a different game with difficult combat. Yeah, you're going to have to learn how each game mechanically feels, but it's kind of the same. You're overcoming the same kind of challenge. So is that as exciting as maybe delving into a new story or a new kind of puzzle where you're really engaging with somebody else's mind, right? You're engaging with the developer and what they really wanted you to think about and experience. Whereas with the mechanics, and maybe that's just us not being as experienced, but I think I find it a bit more samey. Like I want to be surprised. I want to see items I didn't think of, ways to move I didn't think of, and like even experience locations and settings and visuals or music that are enjoyable and new. And that's kind of what I can get out of a game like that that's mechanical.
Yeah, that makes sense. If I think about mechanics beyond just how I move whatever I am on the screen around, and actually into how the rules of the game operate and how my understanding and therefore eventually mastery of those rules will lead to my success in the game, then I'm always seeking out new mechanics. If I think of mechanics purely as, how do I use my mouse or keyboard or gamepad or whatever to achieve success, then that's pretty limited. And I usually am not seeking that. Doesn't mean I can't or won't, but typically that's not what I'm looking for. But if I think of mechanics as essentially the rules of the game, like a new card game that I'm learning, for example, and in the context of video games, then certainly probably don't want to see another game that has exactly the same mechanics as I've seen before. I think that would be boring. I think that
Mhm.
part of what I'm looking for in the novelty of a game is give me a new rule, give me a new mechanic. It's like, why would I want to learn a card game that's exactly the same as the one I've learned before, just with different color cards? It doesn't
Mhm.
matter. The color of the cards is irrelevant. What I'm looking for is a different series of rules that fit seamlessly together with content. Like, again, we've talked about this before, the merging of form and content. I
Mhm.
think in games we're talking about the merging of story, character, writing, voice acting, all of this stuff that merges seamlessly together with the mechanics and the rules of the game, so that they're both kind of along the same theme. They're both communicating kind of the same thing. I don't have any good examples off the top of my head, but I know there are some where the way in which you play the game is the same as what the game is about. You know, if I think of an apocalyptic game like Fallout, I've never actually played Fallout, but I would imagine that the rules of the game, the mechanics of the game, are probably thematically aligned with the characters in the story. That there would be survival rules, there would be radiation rules or whatever, and mechanics that are based on that, not necessarily connected to how fast I click my mouse. So the answer, I guess, is yes. I'm very interested in new mechanics and would be bored without that. I don't need a clone of another game that I've played before. Maybe I would be okay with that once in a while, but yeah.
So I don't think we can talk about challenge and not at least bring up Dark Souls. I think it would be a disservice to this episode if we didn't at least bring it up, because it's probably the most famous example of challenge in video gaming. And I don't think you've played any Dark Souls, have you?
How did you guess? No, I haven't. I certainly am aware of Elden Ring, which is the big deal right now, and has been the big deal right for several months now. But I think I'd heard of Dark Souls before that came out, but knew next to nothing about it. And so I would probably enjoy playing it, but I would it would take me a while to get into the challenge of it, because that's what I understand, that they're meant to be difficult on many levels. That the UI is even difficult in those games. Like, it's designed to be not just served up to you on a plate, but something you have to hunt and figure out for yourself.
Yeah, Dark Souls has always been a game where the loop is everything feels impossible until you learn it well enough to master it. Every fight, especially the boss fights, and this is kind of what I was thinking of in terms of mechanical mastery and challenge. You know, it's punishing. You can maybe take one or two hits from bosses before dying. And mechanically, you have to understand every single type of move the boss can make and exactly how to respond, and physically be able to dodge away and potion, when you need to, and do all these things just to have a chance. And it almost doesn't allow for mistakes, right? It's very punishing. And yet people love it. Dark Souls is one of the most beloved, series of games, and even even people who you think might be frustrated by it, and there are people who are frustrated by it, yes, but for the most part, they've figured something out, how to give a very kind of challenging and frustrating experience and yet make it still feel good and have people want to stick with it. And I think a large part of challenge that works, and maybe something we can finish off talking about here, is the fact that it needs to feel like you could have done more. It was fair. The challenge can't be a random, oh, you just lost because we rolled a die and it says that you lost. It has to feel, when it's mechanically challenging, like you could have done better. In that moment when you lose, you have to be like, oh, I almost got it, right? It was me. I just messed up. And if I do a little bit better, because if it feels like, oh, game's unfair, like there's no way I could have possibly known. And Dark Soul specifically rides that line very finely, because it is unfair, because often you don't know, but the point is you're learning, right? You face a boss, you had no idea it could do all the things, all the different ways it can kill you. And that's the loop, though, is learning about those things and then responding to them. Whereas most games will give you a preview, right? They will show you the ways in which you could fail at something, and then expect you to succeed. And if you don't, right, it's your fault. And I think that's what feels good about a challenge, and why I can go into really hard games and keep pushing at them is because I feel like I almost had it. I could have done a bit better. It was on me. It was not the game being unfair.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Maybe I don't know if this is a good example or a bad example, but The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Super Nintendo game. I played it like a month ago on an emulator on my computer just to be like, okay, what was this experience like? And I've lost all physical ability with this game, but I remember some of the things and how to do things. But the whole game is built around leveling you and your play up, not leveling up your, yeah, you do level up your items, you get different things, but really you're just expanding the number of things that you can do and expanding your capacity to do them. Not just move quickly, but also know that in this situation, in this puzzle, you can use this item to get around this. You can, that in this puzzle, you have to remember what you did the last time you were in something similar. And the whole game is built as a kind of staircase to bring you up slowly but surely. It's probably in a way, probably a very light, slight staircase leading you up. Whereas Dark Souls is probably, little steps and then a giant leap and then little steps and then 7 giant leaps. That's by the sounds of it what it's like. But both seem to be designed around the ascending ladder of ability and bringing you up to speed. Rather than just presenting an abstraction and saying, well, you got to learn this stuff to be able to play the game. What I said before, liberating you into playing the game, that's a very particular kind of game. Whereas what we're talking about now, whether it's Zelda or Dark Souls, is there's no liberation. There's only increase in ability. There's no liberation. There is only reality of getting better and better and better, and the joy in that. And of course, when I played and I defeated some boss, I was like, oh, because it took me 7 tries. Wow, how good did I feel at the end of the 7th try? And so that was really cool. And I think that's uh, a really good conversation to have about games and how they're built, and if all games are built around essentially the increasing of gameplay and capacity, or if newer games are taking a different slant. I don't know, and that's an interesting conversation. Lammy, we're at the end of our time. Is there something in what we just talked about that you want to delve into more? Something that we just touched on, maybe, that you'd like to spend more time thinking about, talking about, digging into?
We haven't talked yet about challenges of game development, which was sort of related but different, right? So I don't know whether that would be a full session, and it would be slightly less focused on gaming as a whole, but more on the development side. But maybe circling back to talking about what challenges you've faced lately, what you foresee the challenges might be in all of this, and what you can do to get over them. But that could be something we could spend some time talking about.
Okay, let's do it. I'll see you next time.
See you next time.